Well, adding to the stress. So let's talk about stress and sort of like its larger context. Like the word almost has become meaningless. Like we say fitness or health, but like what do we really mean by stress? And also how can we actually harness stress and use it to our advantage? So that's what I want to get into today. So when I say stress, like what comes to your mind?
uh, Physical, mental, anxiety, worry, or strain, uh, usually from all external sources, which is good. I imagine some people deal with sort of internal stress or anxiety. I feel mine mostly come from external sources, though we as humans do things to compound, exaggerate, and make worse our own stress, even if we don't mean to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also like recognizing that our response to stress is actually the creator. Like there's a stressor, but the response that we create is actually how we interpret things as stressful or not. So triggers and stressors exist, but how we respond to them is really where we create the emotion of stress or the feeling of stress. And that's an important part. Yeah. And I think like, some people have angst or internal conflict where they're not coming to a decision, or maybe they're up against themselves, fighting themselves internally. Is that what you're talking about?
Right. Like
Absolutely.
otherwise everything's good, but there's an internal stress that is generated, which is like relatable, for a lot of us.
Sure. And I think that's like an unresolved internal conflict that may need resolution that people are dealing with. But this is more things that are going to have an external source, like you were alluding to, right? So there's two basic types of stress that we're going to look at in terms of good versus bad stress, right? And using those labels. So there's eustress, which would be considered positive stress, and distress, which would be considered negative stress. So stress response in the body is very important for survival, right? We, as mammals, right, we have to, through our evolutionary history, we had to respond to stressors in our environment that could kill us, animals, lack of food, things like that. So we have a very finely tuned stress response that we've evolved with in order to respond to danger, right? So our older brain, our amygdala, the base of the brain is cued, hot wired to respond to stress on a regular basis. The problem becomes when that source, that stress detector, is detecting things that aren't actually stressful. And we start to create these patterns in our head of stress response that are on like hypervigilance when there's actually no immediate threat to us. So our base brain is basically set for three settings, right? We have our stress response system, our autonomic nervous system, flight, fight, and do you know what the third one is?
I do not. I've not heard of the third one, I don't think.
Freeze. So there's a freeze response too. So some people will freeze in the face of danger, right? Like some people will fight the gunman, some people will run away, and some people will just freeze. And those are the three stress responses. And sometimes when people have breakdowns or panic attacks, that's actually a freeze response, right? They're having an overactive nervous system response or fear response or stress response, and their body just, they shut down. That's their response to it, right? And some, it depends on the situation. Like sometimes that's a maladaptive response, sometimes it's a logical response to the situation. So, eustress are things that encourage us to, heat, right? Like if something's hot, moving your hand away, right? Or something's dangerous and we're able to move away from it. And in the short term, what it's going to do is improve our survival skills. Our adrenaline's going to pump, right? We're going to think more clearly. Our eyesight will improve. We're more adapted for survival in that moment. But when that stress becomes chronic or over a long period of time, or it's too much in volume for us to actually handle or deal with, then that's going to become distress, and that's going to have a negative consequence. So easiest way to think of it, eustress has a positive benefit, distress has a cumulative negative benefit. Does that make sense?
Yes.
What would you categorize as like eustress for you and distress?
I mean, when I think of eustress, I think of working out or fitness or pushing yourself if it doesn't feel comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Eustress, exercise is a great example, right? So what happens when we exercise too much though? We go into overtraining, right? And what's the response, some of the consequences of that?
Not good. Fatigue, total crash, too much stress on our nervous systems. I imagine central and like the parasympathetic.
Yeah, absolutely. You can just have fatigue, adrenal fatigue, things like that are consequences. You can have over long periods of time, higher blood pressure, more chronic health related issues as well from chronic exposure to stress, right? So just like with exercise, acute bouts of exercise are good, but if we're constantly working and never resting, we fall off the top. We have this sort of bell curve right here. We fall off the top of that, right? So there's a study, there's this guy named Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, there's this concept of flow where sort of like peak engagement or peak arousal meets ability and you get pure performance. Like big wave surfers, like peak athletes, they're right at the top here of that good stress peak right here. So there's enough threat and danger meeting their level of skill to optimize their performance. Any less and they wouldn't have to rise to such a high level, right? The Eustress anymore, and they would exceed their skill level and they would crash and burn. So that's sort of the concept here. We want to hit this sort of mid zone right here where we're peaking our stress. So that's good and bad stress, right? And we talked a little bit, but are you familiar with some of the consequences of chronic stress?
Oh my gosh, I would think they would be across the board. So you could see systemic problems in almost every part of the body, but I imagine like cardiovascular and endocrine system problems. So, blood pressure. From like chronic stress, well, I guess that's leads to other problems that leads to like weight gain, but that would be more symptomatic. But I think someone under stress could experience almost anything negative in the body.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this diagram here is related to the acute sort of responses to prolonged stress. But then down the road, like you could easily link a lot of chronic disease as a secondary consequence of exposure to stress, right? Heart disease, maybe being overweight from eating too much as a stress response, things like that. So it's very easy to look down the chart of like the top 5 causes of death in the US and link stress closely to them in terms of the ones that are especially behavior related, because we'll get into sort of the trigger response system, but our ability to respond appropriately and cope with stress is often overwhelmed by sort of like the chronic exposure to stressors. So then we lead to other coping mechanisms as well. So in the short term, some stress good, too much stress, no good, right? So one of the things that we have is acute stress versus chronic stress. So what would be an example of an acute stressor? What is something that's stressing you out right now? Actually, that's a better question.
At any given point with me, it could be work. So a difficult case, a conflict with opposing counsel, a bad ruling from a judge. That'd be all examples of something acute and problematic in my
Yeah, so present, right? So that presence of the stress would be considered, we have this thing called sort of like the habit loop or the response loop. So that would be considered the trigger in this loop, right? We have this first step in it, right? Now, typically, if you don't mind sharing, like how would you respond to stress like that?
Usually not well. So either, it is an adversarial system. So if I get a ridiculous reply or response from the other side, maybe fire back. So maybe that would be more of a fight response to that stressor.
Sure.
If it's a judge, you don't have that option. So that's like, pull up the wagons, talk to a coworker, get a second opinion. Do we have any recourse here? Can we appeal? But sure, it would be less like outwardly aggressive or immediate.
Yeah, so that you have some good coping or not even coping mechanisms with strategies there. Is there in the past, maybe not work related, but a stressor that you've developed sort of a negative stress response to or negative habit pattern?
Certainly. I think this is relatable to a lot of people. A toxic, bad personal relationship, and all the stress that goes with that, but then not dealing with it well, still engaging with the person and having sort of a negative personal adversarial relationship in which you keep getting more involved and it just keeps getting worse and worse, like a really bad feedback loop.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's more of like a chronic presence of stress too, right? Mm-hmm. So one of the things that within those more stressful relationships will have like acute bouts of stress, right? Like somebody says something to set off a stress response or something. And you can have a habit of like, some people get angry, they throw things, or they yell, or they'll, cry, or they'll go bingy, or they'll go, for a long run, or so. Like those are our coping mechanisms, are our habits that go in accordance with that. So, one common one that we'll see is people, having the trigger, and then perhaps they'll go eat, right? Like food can become comfort in that moment, something like that. So that's generally for most people not a positive attribute or positive reaction to the stress. So within that, the trigger would be, say, like you got in an argument with somebody, you're stressed out, you have some time to yourself, and like if that was me, I would go eat some food or binge eat, because it was something that was helping me escape that feeling of stress in the moment, right? So my pattern, and then the food obviously gives me momentary escape, so that's my reward. So we would want to try to break that pattern, that habituated cycle, right? And we can't really get rid of the trigger necessarily. That's one way, right? If it's something we have the ability to remove. But like, say like traffic makes you stressed out, like, traffic is traffic, it's going to be there, right? And your response is to eat after you get home to just get away from the stress of traffic. So one way to deal with it instead is to find something that you can replace that activity with, that habituated pattern, because we know the trigger isn't there. So we need something that's equivalently rewarding to replace it with. We can't just go cold turkey and get rid of it, because that's not how the brain is programmed. So getting away from the stressor is step one, always. Removing yourself physically from the space or mentally from the presence of the stressor. You can go for a walk, right? Doing something physical is help. If it's a problem that you're stressing over, writing out a solution with a positive outcome, because sometimes we get anxiety and stress about something that we think might happen that's negative. But instead, if we focus on the positive potential outcome, that can provide an alternative narrative that can kind of ease that stress or that tension about what's going to happen. That's similar to reframing the stress. So instead of saying like, oh, why is this happening to me? This is so terrible. Reframing it in the sense that like, hey, like this is good. It's teaching me to do X, Y, and Z, or this is helpful because X, Y, and Z. So reframing that stress. Another way is practicing mindfulness, right? Like meditating, literally getting away from the presence of stress and moving into yourself, right? So, realizing that everything's actually okay and paying attention to that. And then the last one, my favorite, is doing something you unequivocally enjoy that has absolutely no narrative or no sort of preconceived result that you need out of it. So sometimes when I'm super stressed, I like to go hiking, or I like to play video games. Like those two things are never not fun. They have no purpose other than pure enjoyment. And when I'm consumed by them, they're appropriately consuming my attention, so that I'm not thinking about the stress, right? Do you have some things that you do when you're stressed out?
Healthy, healthy, many unhealthy options. No, trying to take the dog for a walk is a good break. And then that's like accomplishing a secondary goal. Lately, sort of separate from workouts, I'm finally getting back to just having a cardio session. Same thing, like great way to jump in. It's additional things sort of even outside our normal, fitness plan, and just sort of get lost, within, especially sprints. I've been really re-embracing lately. Good way to, get rid of consciousness if you're going all out on a treadmill.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great segue, right? Because one of the things that we're talking about is acute, like when the stress is there, but there's also preventative stress measures that build up a buffer against stress, right? When we feel good overall, our tolerance for stressors is better. We can handle more things. Our capacity to deal with stress is greater when we're well rested, and emotionally we feel recharged, right? So this is one of my favorite memes, by the way. This is life. You just everything is okay, just the fire around you. But exercise is one of those great ones, right? It's one of those things that we're not necessarily appreciating the impact of it. Things could be much worse, right? Like you could be not handling stress as well without even realizing it, just because of the buffer you're building up with exercise, right? And same thing for you, Jeremiah, like eating so healthy right now and having your diet aligned so well with your goals. I think that's another thing too. I'm sure that's got to be helping, right?
It's huge. Absolutely. This preventative one really speaks to me, because I feel like I went into COVID without a good tank, without a stockpile. And so it hit all of us really hard. Nothing special about my situation, but going in already kind of stressed and like low on those preventative measures was not good.
Yeah. And also like it always comes back to the kind of simple habits, but they do go so far for us, making sure as well, like you're getting adequate sleep, right? Like your tolerance for stress and your tolerance for other things like your willpower are going to be reduced if you're not sleeping. Some other helpful activities. I put journaling in here and clearly have a typo, not mediation, meditation. Mediation might be good after the fact. But yeah, meditation or journaling, spending some time in mindfulness practice, getting outside, getting some sunlight, some vitamin D, just interacting with a natural space is very helpful for, I know me personally, but I think generally people, once they're able to get away from the sort of the hustle and bustle of an urban environment and get out into nature, it's helpful. Time with, for people that are more extroverted, time with others, interaction, and then time for yourself. If you're more introverted, like I'm more a balance, but tend to be more introverted. So sometimes time by myself is exactly the recharge that I need to shift perspective. And then what I would say is like regular time out, right? That time we talked about, playing video games, going for a hike, doing those things that have no other purpose, but they're just a little bit hedonistic, like they're just for you to enjoy and no other purpose other than that. And I think so much of our cult of busyness that we live in doesn't leave time for those things, right?
Correct.
Do you notice, in your, professional circle, do you see people taking these measures into account when they're creating their schedules or their day?
Some people, it sort of depends with my coworkers, like how many kids they have, because that sort of eats in. Family time is, super important. But even then, I think of coworkers who, one of my coworkers is on a great family trip, road trip, hiking trip right now with her family. So it's like, in that situation, combining what you want with what other people want and having like pure recreational time. My team's actually pretty good at it. My coworkers are actually pretty good at trips. They do a sort of a work hard, play hard mentality, get a lot of work in, but then making sure you're having pure recreational time. Some good travelers on my team. So lots of trips back in the day.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's important too. And I think also, like you alluded to, going on those trips, like your family can be stressful for you, or it can be a source of de-stress too, right? And again, I think you looked at this beforehand because you're just the master of segues right now into the next section. So this brings us to an interesting point. This is a book that I'm reading right now. They call The Upside of Stress, and it's about reframing stress. So highly recommend this book by Kelly McGonigal, and it's this concept that it's not stress that's important, it's how we frame the existence of stress in our life that has a long-term health impact. So they did a study with people that rated like how stress fit into their lives, obviously either positively or negatively, and they did a sort of long-term mortality study. And the people that were rating stress as a positive influence in their lives lived significantly longer than the others with other factors controlled. So it was interesting. Obviously, it's a challenging thing because there's so many commingling factors in a study like that. But the book goes into a lot of detail on how there's a lot of evidence of the way that we process and contextualize our emotional experiences can have a physiological effect on us, right? So one of the things that I took from the book was this idea that we can harness stress as a power that we can use for productivity, enhancing skills, and things like that, right? So back to the idea of eustress, we need some stress in order to grow. Otherwise, we'll become complacent. We won't do anything. So some of these stressors are actually lessons that we need to learn, failures, or they push us to excel or to innovate in order to improve. So one of the things that I've been working on and I've been kind of coaching clients with is, let's create a learned response of positive reaction to stress, right? So we have a lot of learned responses, right? Sometimes they're very positive, right? Something bad happens, they're like, I'll get it next time. Other people, something bad happens, I'm a failure, right? So they have that fixed mindset. So just like in that way, we can coach or teach or reinforce reframing stress into a positive association. So when stress comes, instead of being like, oh, I'm so stressed out, there's so much to do, saying, hey, like this is making me stronger, or this is teaching me something, or this, I'm excited because this means I'm heading in the right direction. I'm doing things, I'm doing the right thing in that direction, and flipping that script. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
I mean, it would be amazing to even improve 5% down that path. You know what I mean?
Sure.
Like being able, any harnessing would be.
Yeah, and one thing to make this as simple as possible, because I know how busy you are and a lot of people are, is creating a mantra, which I know sounds kind of goofy, but I got this from one of the, the coaches that I work. His name is Jonathan, and he uses this in his life, and his mantra has to do with sort of like how he contextualized being really fatigued and worn out in his pursuits. And, he basically created a mantra that was saying like he was being groomed for greatness. So when he was super tired and he was exhausted and he was worn out and he didn't want to do anymore, instead of saying like I'm tired or I'm worn out or I'm exhausted, he was saying like I'm being groomed for greatness. Like this is serving a larger purpose outside of myself. And I'm here, like this is my testimony to like bear this kind of thing. So for me, like I have a similar mantra that I use, which is like this concept that like, like something strong is brought up from like hard forces, right? Like struggle builds strength and builds prosperity and things like that. So I like to say, like I have this kind of saying, and it's a little corny, but it's what resonates with me, is that like heat turns iron into steel. And it's the idea that like you need, like this is part of the process. If you want the ultimate result, like it's not going to be easy. So this is not something unexpected or afferent. It's part of the process. And that helps me kind of go through it and go like that. So what do you think about something like that?
I think it's super interesting and it can be super helpful. I mean, without having like an exact wording down, I've been reconnecting with some old high school friends, and our backgrounds are we have a lot of shared things in our backgrounds, but the interesting part for us is, which may not be true of other people, we felt our childhoods were maybe more difficult with our family situations, our socioeconomic situations, and that was really hard, but we're stronger for it now, or able to deal with a little more and actually like happier, and maybe not everyone feels that way. Maybe, hopefully everyone's happy through their entire life, but, we've been really bonding over sort of these shared past experiences that we think made us stronger. And so we survive, like you hear that a lot, but just surviving, sometimes you realize you're stronger having done it.
Yeah, well, I think that's testament to how you framed your experiences, right? Not everyone would frame their experiences that way. And some people are enfeebled by trauma that they've had, right? They default back to it, as opposed to like you're saying like, hey, like I was made stronger by going through this. Like that.
I think a great analogy is how muscles are built and grow bigger, right? They are ripped and torn and heal together in a stronger way.
Yeah, absolutely. A thicker muscle fiber. Exactly. That's a perfect metaphor for it. I think, the point basically being that like, hey, like if you decide that the struggle you're going through is meaningful to something that you want, then it won't stress you out as much because it's part of the larger narrative. It's part of the story. Versus if you seek comfort and avoidance, then of course you're going to be stressed by things that get in your way. So I think it's a conscious practice because we're programmed for comfort and survival. But if we can instead sort of anticipate and welcome things that are stressful and challenging, then our reaction to them is going to have a much more positive effect. Imagine like the person that can have something terrible happen to them and obviously deal with it emotionally, but also just be like, hey, like, what can I gain from this? As opposed to like, what is this going to do to me?
Right. Atomic Habits is really good at that, like how we frame things, and how we can, choose to frame them. What might be seen as a negative as like a benefit or a privilege.
Yes. Yeah. Cognitive reframing is very, very important, right? Because there are things that objectively from the outside are bad. They're events we would rather not have happen, but the way that we contextualize them just decides what role they're going to play, I think. And that's the same here with stress. It's like how it's going to happen. What do we want it to do to us? Do we want it to empower us or enfeeble us? And that's, I think, the essential question. So if you have the chance, I know obviously you're super busy, but at the gym, throw the audiobook on and check this one out. It's pretty good.
No, it's funny you say that. I will not make that mistake again. Everything's going to be audiobook going forward because I can treat it like a podcast, car, dog walks, gym, versus like I kind of limited myself by getting Atomic on Kindle. Words. Yeah, audio from now on, everything.
Yeah, well, I mean, when time is of the essence, we're all about efficiency. But so any final thoughts? Like, did you find this helpful? What are your thoughts?
Super helpful. It's super important and all stuff I want to work on, because when you're experiencing acute stress in the moment, kind of by definition, it feels like the worst thing ever. But I really want to make sure in the future it doesn't sort of have an avalanche effect, or like incrementally you're taking on more stress. You're either not getting a break from it, or you're not working on that preventative stress mitigating bank. And then you find yourself in a tough spot, sliding back into bad habits or, negative escapism.
Yeah, absolutely. And like everything, right? There's no one size fits all answer. A lot of this is subjective, a lot of it's opinionative. Some of these things are proven, some work for some people, some don't. But I think the biggest thing is like taking the time to figure out what are the preventative measures and then the acute responses that can help you manage stress rest, and how you answer the question of like what is the purpose of stress in your life. Those are things that everybody can work on. And as always, maddeningly for some people, it's a moving target, and it's something that's going to be a lifelong pursuit. But as you know, like stress is probably one of the least, well, I guess it's getting more response now, but least talked about killers in our society, and also inhibiting so much potential from a lot of people because they can't manage it adequately.
Right.
Like that. Well, Jeremiah, it's been a pleasure as always. I love these conversations we get to have.
Thank you. This was great. Like, yeah, stress is like always topical with professionals and small business owners.
100%. Yeah, it's our lives, but I think like it's one of those things, like if we can conquer it and harness it, like the better we are for it, and maybe we can help teach other people too, which is even better to spread that word. So I will not take up any more of your precious time so you don't get more stress. I appreciate you, and I'm looking forward to Friday. I mean, you keep making more progress. I love it.
Excellent. It's been